Hello, everybody. Welcome to Room and Board. I'm Zachary Groombridge, and this is the Rule Book Club. This is the book club for people who like tabletop role-playing game rule books. Every month we read a rule book, then we come here and we talk about it. And usually I'm very positive, but today I'm going to be a negative Nancy. I'm going to be, Mr. Grumpy Pants, because I did not like this month's book. What book did we read this month? Mythic, the tabletop role-playing game. This game has been sort of sold and billed as the tabletop role-playing game that you can play solo, or that you can play in a group with a bunch of people without a game master. This is the game billed as the game you can play with no preparation. The game you can improvise. It's so innovative, this game is. I heard about this game. I was looking around for games to talk about on this show, and I posted in a couple forums and things like that. Be like, hey, what kind of tabletop role playing games would be interesting to talk about? And in a bunch of different forums, you should talk about Mythic. You should talk about Mythic. And I was like, oh, cool. I have not heard about Mythic. Oh, it's a single player tabletop role playing game? Super curious. I don't know anything about single-player tabletop role-playing games. I've never really been interested in playing a tabletop role-playing game alone. And I'm not a big solo gamer anyway, right? I don't usually play board games solo. And sort of, I was curious about the concept. How could a solo tabletop role-playing game work? And why would I want to play a solo tabletop role-playing game instead of just, sitting down and writing a short story or writing some fan fiction? What is the value proposition in that? So I sat down to this book kind of like hopeful, right? This is a brand new world, a world of something interesting that I have not experienced before. And, I open it up and I'm really eager to read the foreword of this book, the first couple pages to describe what kind of game this is. Oftentimes, when I sit down to read a tabletop role-playing game book, the foreword is often it's the part I'm usually most excited to read in books that I don't end up enjoying and don't really want to play the actual game. I often don't enjoy the foreword. If when the author tries to describe their game, they don't sell me on it, I know that I'm going to have a really hard time selling it to players to play the game. If the author can't sell me the game, having sat down and really thought about, like they're an author, right? They had more time to think about the perfect pitch to this game and put it in their foreword. Not even just a pitch. They had enough time to sit down and write the perfect explanation, the perfect distillation of what this game is, and to hand it to you and say, this is what I have written. Like, this is what you are going to be going through all the other pages in this book in order to get at. And so, a lot of tabletop role-playing games, I'll read the beginning and I'll go, oh, yes, I can't wait to finish this book. Sometimes I read the beginning and it's obvious that sort of the foreword, the description is a little perfunctory, right? As if the author is sort of like, doesn't know what to say when they're writing. And oftentimes those kinds of tabletop role-playing games are not doing anything particularly innovative or exciting, right? They're just sort of another tabletop role-playing game. And the foreword describing how to play the game or what the game is sort of a little hollow because the author is in the end just sort of taking a long time to say, it's like any other basic Dungeons and Dragons game. And then there are other books, and you'll read the foreword, and it feels like the author is trying to hide what the game is from you, right? They're trying to hype it up while at the same time obfuscating what the game is because there isn't a whole lot there. And of those three kinds of forwards, the kind of forward that gets you excited, the kind of forward that tells you it's just going to be kind of derivative, and the forward that says this is a nothing burger. This was nothing burger with extra sauce. And so I read the forward and I was like, oh no. Like I don't like the way that this author is describing this game, and what they are describing is both a little confusing but also not exciting at all. And after I read the forward, I was like, I don't know if I want to read the rest of this book. And then I plunged into getting a little bit further into this book, and I detested what I read. I really just did not like it. I put the book down and I was like, I don't know if I can finish reading this book, right? And like, not because there's anything taste-wise here that's untasteful. I don't like the philosophy of this game at its heart, right? I don't like what this game is setting out to do. I think it's uninteresting. I think it's a waste of paper. I've had a couple cracks at this video, and I've rambled a little bit, and I've like fumed a little bit, and I've been a little full of stagnant water. And I'm having trouble articulating my feelings about this book in our traditional 4 pillars of review. But I'm going to try to sort of get at it. We're going to skip conversation, our first pillar. And we're going to swing back around it because I have the most to say about what kind of conversation Mythic creates or is attempting to create at a table. Instead, we're going to go to mechanics, because I think that the mechanics section of this book is going to be the shortest and maybe the most bitter. So, second pillar, what mechanics make up Mythic, the tabletop role-playing game? And essentially, you have a table called the Fate Table. And you ask a yes or no question: is there a castle on a hill? You roll some dice, you determine some modifiers, and that dice will be a percentage chance of a yes and the percentage chance of a no. Is there a castle on that hill? No. Is it an inn on the hill? No. Is there nothing on the hill? No. And that's the mechanic of the game. The whole mechanic. There aren't other mechanics in Mythic. The entire mechanic of this game is asking yes or no questions, rolling some dice, consulting a table to either get a yes or a no. And that's essentially it. That's the whole thing, right? How do you play this game without a game master? You ask a lot of yes or no questions. How do you play this game with zero preparation? You ask a lot of yes or no questions, right? Is the treasure in a dungeon? Yes. Is the dungeon nearby? No. Oh, wow, we're playing a role-playing game, guys. I'm being reductive here, right? There are sort of nuances to this. Find out the answer, whether yes or no. I think most of those nuances are uninteresting. I think most of those nuances are boring. Something that this mechanically, I suppose, that this game also does, it asks you to write a paragraph about a thing, about your character. You write a little paragraph. You write a paragraph about the country that you're in, the city that you're in, what have you. And then you go through, as a group of players around the table, if you're playing with other people, or alone, if you're alone, and you pull out details, quote unquote, from that paragraph. So if I said, Zach is a charming and handsome man who can shoot lasers out of his eyeballs and really only wants to become the greatest chef in the world. And that was my paragraph describing my character, Zach, the laser chef. I would then go through that paragraph and I would pull out details and make them part of my character. For instance, laser eyes would be a detail. Handsome would be a detail. Chef might be a detail. And then you assign all of these details a value. And this book makes a big point about saying, oh yes, all these values will be in regular, everyday, common language. No math here. Really, essentially, you're just placing all of these details upon a scale, right? Basically, you say, oh yes, his laser eyes are average. His chef cooking ability is superhuman. His handsomeness detail is above average. And really, you're just sort of assigning zeros plus ones, minus ones, plus twos, to rolls associated with those attributes. Right. So you're going to write these paragraphs. You're going to pull out details. You're going to assign these details values in common language, and then when questions, yes or no questions, come up that involve those details, you're going to apply those modifiers to your dice to then roll on the tables. And the table is always going to tell you yes or no. Really, really yes, really, really no. And that's all I will say. And that's the mechanics of the game. There's not a whole lot to engage with. There's not a whole lot to manipulate. If you were playing, just as a common example, like Dungeons and Dragons, right? There's a lot of different systems, and those systems have various mechanics associated with them. Resource management, or overland travel, or movement, or puzzle solving. They all have different mechanics that interact with those different systems. And those mechanics are sort of designed to create feelings, right? They're designed to create situations. But, none of those things exist within Mythic. There aren't various systems. There aren't a bunch of mechanics. There's asking yes or no of a table. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. A game that has few mechanics can be a fine game, as long as those mechanics are fun to interact and play with. So what is it like to play with the mechanics in Mythic, the role-playing game system? I don't think you really can play with them. So in the entire game is asking yes or no questions and sort of extrapolating a world and actions from the yeses and nos that the table is going to tell you. It's Magic 8-Ball. It's shaking a Magic 8-Ball as a role-playing game system. And so there's not a whole lot to interact with sort of mechanically there. The only thing that's sort of player-facing that you can interact with as a player is how you phrase your questions. As to go to a previous example, is there a castle on the hill? Yes or no? Not super exciting. Instead, I might ask, does the vampire in the castle on the hill seek my blood? Right? That's a little bit more of an interesting question. There's no sort of instructions in Mythic, the tabletop role-playing game, about sort of encouraging or helping you to structure interesting questions. In fact, the game sort of goes out of its way to sort of outline ways that you can ask questions that the game thinks are too self-serving or aggressive, right? You could ask this game system, is there a magical sword on the ground in front of me? You could walk into a room and say, like, is a genie here to answer my questions and grant all my worldly desires? You could walk into a room and be like, does God come down from the heavens and bestow upon me immortality? Yes or no? Roll some dice. And the game, in some like text boxes and things, will say like, well, no, if you do any of that kind of stuff, you're being a power gamer, and power gamers should be discouraged. And reading that in this book frustrated me a bit. So let's talk about power gamers for a second. Every game should encourage power gamers. And if being a power gamer hurts your game, it's not a very good game to begin with. If you're playing Pathfinder, right? This is a game that has a really deep, detailed, complex character building system, right? And if you show up to a game of Pathfinder and your friend says, oh, yeah. No, I took Psionic for 3 levels, and then I switched to Wizard for 2 so I could get a couple of feats, and now I can cast cantrips. And then I also took Stonemason for then 4 levels, and then I can combine the cantrips with this ability that I got from Stonemason and my Psionic Mind Blast ability, which allows me to do a ton of damage and instantly kill any creature with a single hit. You don't turn to that player and say, oh, well, you're power gaming. You shouldn't do that. No, your friend who has built this character as a psionic wizard stonemason, this isn't a real thing, is interacting with the mechanics and systems of the game, right? They're playing with the tools. They're playing in the playground that Pathfinder has built for them to play in. And your game master in Pathfinder has all the same tools, all the same toys in the playground to build challenges for you as players to overcome, right? There's no such thing as building too good a character in Pathfinder. The game is about building a powerful character. If you're playing a game and interacting and playing with the mechanics of the game breaks the game, it's not a good game. There is only one mechanic in Mythic, and that is to ask yes or no questions. And if asking certain yes or no questions breaks the game, well, that's all there is to interact with. The only thing you can do as a player to play with this game, the mechanics in this book, is to ask creative, inventive, and self-serving questions. But the rule book is like, whoa, don't ask questions that are power gaming. And so that sort of bugs me. Like, what are you supposed to do then? How are you supposed to interact with the mechanics in this book if interacting with them too self-servingly breaks the game, stops the game from working? I don't know. Then it also calls out in this book, hey, don't ask questions that are too deep. And what does it mean by deep? It explains deep yes or no questions as questions that have implications that are too large for yes and no. For example, if I shot my pistol at a bad guy in this game and I said, does my bullet accelerate to the speed of light? Well, that's too deep a question. Because if we answer yes, then we've established as a fact in this game that bullets fired out of pistols are moving at the speed of light. And, that's too deep. It's too deep. The implications are too broad, right? And, yeah, it's probably kind of a mean thing to be like, oh, yeah, well, now my bullets are shooting at the speed of light because I asked a yes or no question. But that's the only mechanic in the game, right? And this is an extreme example. So, like, what kind of questions should you ask? If you can't ask deep questions that have implications, and you can't ask self-serving questions, because that's too power gaming, well, then it also calls out in this book, well, don't ask nested yes or no questions, which it would be like, does the vampire in the castle on the hill want to kill me? Because that question is really, according to this book, 3 yes or no questions. Is there a castle on the hill? Yes or no. Is there a vampire in that castle on the hill? Yes or no. And does that vampire want to kill me? Yes or no. And then here I am. I've tried to sneak in 3 answers into one question. But that means you're really, like, in a game where the only way you can interact with its mechanics is by asking yes or no questions and by setting up, details from paragraphs that you've written. There's nothing here to interact with, right? There's nothing here to manipulate. There's nothing here to play with. And this is a game. And if there's nothing here to play with, then what is here really? And when I was reading this book, I was getting really annoyed at this. I was like, what is this book trying to do, right? Well, like, why is this the only mechanic, and why does it exist in the way that it does? And it exists in the way it does. It's the only mechanic in this game because this game wants to allow someone who is playing a game solo to play without a game master, to play without preparation. And because of that, it has to have like very few mechanics, and that mechanic needs to satisfy every possible situation. So asking yes or no questions, shaking the magic 8 ball is all of this rule set can do. And I think it's just an uninteresting mechanic. And I thought when I was reading this, am I being unfair? When you boil it down, so many tabletop role-playing games essentially are asking or are using dice to determine the results of things that happen in the world. You play Dungeons and Dragons, and you take your spear and you stab at a goblin, and you roll some dice, and that dice is going to tell you whether you hit. And you could interpret that as being, hey, I rolled some dice, and it told me yes or no, I did or didn't hit. And so, like, hey, am I being overly critical by saying the structure of this game just being asking and answering yes or no questions? Like, what am I being too harsh on it? And I don't think so. And I think there are a lot of sort of philosophical reasons why I think there are big differences between this book just answering yes or no and, for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, stabbing at a goblin and rolling some dice. And I think I'm going to have to talk about that when we get to the conversation, our first pillar. Because I have stuff to say. I don't know if I'll be articulate when I say it. So mechanically, what do I think of this game? I think it's bad. I think it's uninteresting. I think it's boring. There's nothing here mechanically to sink your teeth into or play with. And if you are a solo player wanting to... There's no mechanics here to interact with even, right? So as a solo player, I don't know what mechanically you are being engaged with when you're sitting alone at a table playing this game. And I guess the answer I have to answer myself with is you're writing paragraphs, right? And then you're plucking details out of those paragraphs and you're assigning values to them, very strong laser eyes, so that you can then ask yes or no questions based on those details. But I don't see how those mechanics are any more interesting than just sitting down and writing a short story for yourself. In fact, I think it's a lot more restrictive. So let's go to our third pillar. I think we'll go to conversation next, but we'll go to our third pillar, the setting. What setting does this book have? It's got no setting, right? This is a system allowing you to play any tabletop role-playing game in any setting without a game master or without a preparation or with a game master and a bunch of friends. There's no setting in this book. There's not even an implied setting in this book. And a lack of setting is not damning, right? There are tabletop role-playing games out there that are setting agnostic. They do not have a setting. I think probably the most well-known example is GURPS, GURPS. Don't know what the G stands for, but it's G, Universal Role-Playing Game System, I believe. GURPS, G-U-R-F, you know what I mean. Anyway, GURPS also does not have a setting. It is setting agnostic. You can use GURPS to play in any setting. And because of that, GURPS is sort of maligned as being a little bit of a droll read, but GURPS is full of mechanics. There's systems in GURPS. We've already talked about mechanics in Mythic. It's very light on mechanics. So, like, what do you expect out of a book like this that doesn't have a setting built in? Like, what do you want, setting-wise, out of it? And I think my answer is you want a system that allows you, if it has no setting built in, you want a system that gives you the tools to create a setting. And what is a setting made out of? It's not only sort of time and place. It is also sort of feeling, right? If you're playing a well-written cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game, interacting with the mechanics and systems of that game elicit the setting of that game. If you're playing a spy thriller role-playing game, the way that the rules in that game create situations and the way the rules in that game answer questions reinforces the fact that it is a spy thriller, that it is a thriller, right? There are certain sort of tropes and shapes that stories take in different settings, and those rule sets support those settings. There's no rules in here to help you create a setting or reinforce a setting or establish tropes, because all this book can really do at the end of the day is say yes or no. And you can ask so many yes or no questions that you sort of build up a reference book, right? You've established so many yes or no's about the world that you sort of know what the world is, but those don't help you create a setting. In the end, you're going to have to write little descriptions about everything and then pull details out of those in order to create the percentage chances for your yes and no's. And all of that sort of needs to just get plucked out of the minds of the players around the table. There's no way to create a unified understanding of a setting between a bunch of people in order to write those paragraphs, to pluck out those details, to assign them values, in order to roll on this yes or no chart, right? How do you bring a bunch of people around a table together thinking about the same situation, the same place and time in the same way? There are no real tools for that in this book, and so I don't know, it doesn't really offer anything setting-wise. It doesn't offer anything as a way to build an understanding of setting as a group. There is a game, I listened to I think it's a podcast, and the people on this podcast were playing a one-shot of a tabletop role-playing game that was about creating dialects, talking about how languages branch and change. And all the mechanics in that game were about creating new words and slang, using those words and slang in conversation. And by the end of playing a session of that game, you had a dialect. I don't know what the name of this game was. I'm gonna have to look it up. I know it's on my list of stuff to read for this show. But even that game, and the only mechanics in that game were to create a language and use that language with each other, and in how to interact with that. There were rules in that game that created setting, that created a unity of understanding at the players around the table about what kind of language they're building and what kind of world that language came from, as a way to then continue to develop a brand new dialect. This game doesn't have any tools for that. The only thing this book harps on, it comes back to it over and over again, is it says, like, hey, when you're ever stuck and you don't know how to proceed, or there's a disagreement around the table, use logic. Use logic. The first, like, bunch of pages in this book, over and over again, sort of don't say anything, don't give any real advice, and just sort of mention, use logic to come to a conclusion. It says on the back of this book, one of these things, a role-playing game based on common sense, logic, and everyday language. But it doesn't give you, as a rule book, it doesn't give you sort of a rules or foundation for how the logic in this game should work. And well-written tabletop role-playing games should give you a foundation, a advice on how to think about the game and the way the game wants you to think about it. I'm probably getting too in the weeds and too theoretical here to make sense, so feel free to cut any of this conversation, Chris. But yes, Mythic does not offer anything setting-wise. As a sort of a book-wise, it's got no setting in it. It's got some pictures in it that are not really coherent with each other. It seems like random art, and none of it is particularly high quality. None of it is particularly readable, this book. It takes a long time to say some very simple things, and a lot of it doesn't feel very useful. Failure as far as setting goes. Yeah. Let's go to our first pillar, the conversation, because what kind of conversation does this book, Mythic, create on a tabletop? So when you and some players, your friends, are sitting around and you're playing a tabletop role-playing game, you're talking to each other, you're having a conversation, and you're playing. It's a role-playing game, you're playing. You're being players, right? And you're interacting with the mechanics of the game, you're interacting with each other, you're hearing what each other are saying, you're riffing off of that. The kinds of conversations that this game, I think, would create sound so unenjoyable to me. In order to interact with the mechanics of this game, you need to write a paragraph about a thing, like yourself, your character. You need to pull out details of that character. You need to assign those details values. You need to frame yes or no questions. You need to roll a percentile dice. You get a yes or no answer. Then you need to discuss, using logic, whatever that means, with all the other players around the table about what that yes or no means in the context of your question. And none of these things that you're going to be talking about, right? You're going to be talking about your paragraph, about the details, about what modifiers get applied, about your question. None of these conversations around the table are inside the fiction of the universe that you're playing in, right? When you are playing Dungeons and Dragons, I say, me, Zachary me, Doug the Barbarian, am stabbing the goblin that's in front of me, Doug the Barbarian. And I roll some dice as Zach the player and find out that Doug the Barbarian has achieved his goal of stabbing the goblin. And so in conversation around the table, I can hear Dwight, my friend from the office, describe his character do a thing. And he can roll his dice, and I see the result of the dice as he sees the result of his dice. And we all understand immediately what happened inside the world, inside the fiction, inside the story that we are role-playing in. And the conversation around the table can, for the most part, be about that story, about our characters in a situation. Mythic requires you to talk so much as players and not characters, right? To talk about the rules and not the action. And that is incredibly, it sounds so dull to me. I hope that made sense. When I was in university, I went to university for acting. And a big part, learning how to act and theories and philosophy of acting is you're learning how to tell stories, right? You're learning how to communicate, right? How to communicate effectively and how to illustrate stories, how to interact with people, how to listen to other people. And when I was in university, I started reading tabletop role-playing games, and one of the things that got me really hooked on tabletop role-playing games was a lot of tabletop role-playing games were discussing the same sort of lessons I was learning in university, right? How to tell a story really well, how to illustrate things, how to be communicative, how to listen to other people, how to take in what other people are saying and then improve and add upon that and hand it back to them. And the difference between what I learned in university as an actor and what tabletop role-playing games were saying was that tabletop role-playing games were trying to mechanize the same sort of lessons that I had learned in university, trying to create systems. And when you interact with those systems, it is creating a communication around this table. It is creating a story around this table. I remember one of my the first things, and like a eureka light bulb popped above in my head, was we were in school and we were learning about actions. And I'm going to go on a little actor diatribe right now. But what are actions in acting? You get a script and you look at every line in that script, every word in that script that you are going to say, and you assign a verb to all of those lines and words, right? Because your character as an actor is always doing something. It's always trying to achieve something. And so every word, every little bit of blocking, every phrase, every glance has intent, is actionable, has a verb glued to it. And we had just learned this in class, and I was at home and I was actioning scripts, and I was like, I'm going to take a break from this and read a tabletop role-playing game. And I was reading I believe it was one of the Powered by the Apocalypse games. And I was reading the basic rules of that game, and I was recognizing the terminology in the tabletop role-playing game that I had just been learning in class that day about actioning, because the rules in the Powered by the Apocalypse game were all about inserting active verbs and mechanizing them, gamifying them in really fun and interesting ways. And I was like, whoa, I'm seeing the planets have aligned. I'm seeing the Matrix here, because storytelling is storytelling, whether it's as an actor or playing a tabletop role-playing game. Communicating with others is communicating with others, whether it's on a stage playing plays in a playhouse or hanging out with your friends in your living room. Communication is communication. And one of the things I really started enjoying looking for when I read tabletop role-playing games is sort of the philosophy of communication. Like how do you communicate with other people? How do the rules within this book encourage people around a table to talk and communicate and have the same language to interact and build a story together? I don't think that exists in Mythic. And the philosophy behind Mythic is diametrically opposed to what I think about when I think about tabletop role-playing games. And maybe that's just a me thing, because I have this background as an actor. But what kind of a conversation does this game create around the table? John is going to be turning to everyone else and being like, is there a castle on that hill? And then we're all going to talk about, well, did we even discuss, are there hills in this world? Why would there be a castle up there? Well, I think we have written down on this, we've given ourselves a detail of this area, and the detail is that, there are vampires about, and I think it's logical to say that vampires live in castles, so we should give you a phase shift up on your dice roll to answer this yes or no question about whether or not there is a castle on the top of that hill. Does everyone else agree? Yeah, we all agree. Okay, you roll the dice. It's a yes. Okay, yeah, we know there's a castle on top of that hill. That's the conversation I envision for this game, and that doesn't sound like role playing to me. This doesn't sound like you're inside a story. That sounds like you and your friends sort of trying to desperately collaboratively write a thing in the most obtuse manner I could possibly imagine, right? There are storytelling games out there that have players communicating with each other and telling a story together. There are map drawing games where the mechanics of the game involve just adding things to a map. And as the map gets passed around and people discuss and talk about the map, a story sort of blossoms around the table without the conversation of the players around the table sort of being this perfunctory nonsense. I do not like the kind of conversation that this promises to create around the table at all. Oh, I don't know if I've made any sense here. I'm going to have to re-listen back to this. There's no verbs here. There's no verbs here, right? This is all adjectives. And it's all passive, socially distant adjectives. I think the conversation that this game creates is slightly more interesting if we're talking about it in the context as a single-player tabletop role-playing game, right? Because if you're sitting at the table all alone and you decided you want to play a tabletop role-playing game and you're playing this system and you're asking yourself yes or no questions and you're writing down little paragraphs and you're pulling out details, I can see how none of that situation, like none of you playing a solo tabletop role-playing game is going to be active, right? You're not going to be sort of in the world of the characters in the same way as you can be with your friends around a table, right? I remember when me, Chris, and Brandon, my roommate, were playing Mouse Guard. All the time, we around the table would talk to each other as our characters constantly. And I don't see that happening in Mythic, because so much of the conversation is not going to be about the characters. It's going to be about this sort of singular, obtuse nonsense mechanic that might as well be a magic 8-ball. 1 second. This is probably getting long. Like, I was just thinking, like, how can I clarify my thoughts on this game? And I was like, well, I remember reading all of the examples in this book and just sort of picking them apart and looking at them being like, this looks so uninteresting and boring and pedantic. And I could read through these examples and talk about why I think that, like, because these are the best case scenario. Like, the author of this book has written these examples in this book about how this game gets played, right? And he has had every opportunity, I assume it's a he, maybe a she, they have gone to the I presume that they have play tested their game, right? I presume that they have examples of this game working in the way that the writer-designer intended this game to work. And I presume that these examples are good examples of this game working as intended. And I read these examples and I roll my eyes because this conversation sounds agonizing. The examples of play in this book remind me of people having arguments on Reddit, right? It reminds me of people having discussions on forums, and not enjoyable discussions, like the worst kind of discussions. I have no interest in a tabletop role-playing game that just creates those situations. I'm not going to bore you with these examples, right? Because I'm going to need to give you more context about the game to explain these examples and then criticize them. And I don't want to give you more context about this game. It's bad. Let's go to our final pillar. How do you use this game? My answer is you don't. Don't use Mythic. If you want to play a tabletop role-playing game by yourself, my advice is to just write short stories. Do some creative writing, right? Go to a fan fiction website and write some fan fiction and put it up and get some feedback, and you will have more fun, I think, right? I think that's more creative, exciting. You can look up writing prompts on the internet. There are lots of ways that you can stretch your muscles as an imaginer of things. And I think all of them are more exciting and more active and more involved than sort of the rigmarole of this. Yeah, don't use this book. I mean, like, also, I feel like you could boil down, how many pages is this book? 141 pages. 141 pages. Probably 20, 30 of them are just example play, maybe the whole back of this book. So, you're probably looking at 80 pages worth of just rules in here. And I think you could probably boil this whole book down into like a 4-page handout. And I still don't think it would be interesting. I don't think it would be worth your time. I don't think it would be a good role-playing game. It's barely a functioning single mechanic. But, you could probably buy a 2-page spread explaining this entire game in, for what, like a 20th of the cost of this stupid book? Yeah, that's my thoughts. Have I been too scathing? Have I not explained myself well enough? I'm afraid that I'm full of feelings about this game, and I'm afraid that I haven't articulated them well enough. I guess I'll have to watch and see. And you know what? As a response to Mythic, how much I dislike Mythic, I think we're going to talk about a tabletop role-playing game that I do like, and that I sort of referenced today. We'll talk about the Powered by the Apocalypse world system, Powered by the Apocalypse system next month. I don't know if I'll pick a specific Powered by the Apocalypse game, or whether I will just talk about them all generally, because I think it's an old system now, right? This is not the new hotness, Powered by the Apocalypse. And I think the biggest effect that it has had on role-playing games in general has sort of already been felt. The shockwave has passed. And I think if you're already interested in tabletop role-playing games, you already know everything you need to know about Powered by the Apocalypse. But I think we're going to talk about it, specifically as like a response to this game, because there are things I want to sort of say, and I need to describe other games in order to say them clearly about this one. So, yeah, we're going to be talking about Powered by the Apocalypse, probably Apocalypse World next month. That was maybe a very fraught episode of the Rulebook Club. This was Mythic. I'm Zach, and this was the Rulebook Club. It's the book club for people. Oh no, what was my phrase? It's the book club. It's the Rulebook Club. It's the book club that rules. I think that was it.